Why don't we just get going as we have people join us here? And I'll just start by welcoming everybody to our Leading from the Top series here. I think this is what the sixth year, Joe. I think we've been doing this with
Yep,
differentiating
we've
strategies.
been
Yeah,
partnership with the chamber for 6 years doing executive development for small and
yeah.
small and medium businesses.
Yes, it's been great for us. I think those that participate and learn a lot. And Joe's a great resource and helpful not just during these sessions, but afterwards too, where people can connect with Joe. So we really appreciate what you're doing there. Today we're doing a 2-session series on. Today is leading amid conflict, and then we'll have follow up in the end of April on confrontation. So.
Mhm.
With that, I know we have people that are participating, and we are recording this session, so we'll have it, on our website posted, so people can go back to it, and others who missed today can go to it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up for our participants to interact. So for those of you who are listening, if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself and ask that question. I think, Joe, if something comes up during the presentation, you're okay with taking questions at that
Yeah,
time?
I think let's approach this as if this is a discussion,
Okay.
and we want to deliver stuff that's of value to all of you. So as we're talking about something, if you want to slow down, if you want to back up, if you have a question, let's just go ahead and do that. You're not going to throw me, off schedule on this. That's the way I'm used to interacting with groups. So
So great.
let's
So
do that.
I will open it up for everybody, and I'll just kick it over to you, to Joe. And also, I gotta remind everybody, Joe's also an author. Released a book this past fall, I think, and
Yes.
we wish you a lot of success with that too. So with that, Joe, take
Thank
her
you.
away.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Look forward to interacting with you today. If you have your microphones and on mute until you want to talk, that might save us from some background noises and help everybody else. I know we've done that in other presentations and other interactions we've done, but jump in there if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll take it from there. First of all, who am I? I'm Joe Thompson. I've worked for about 25 years in various Fortune 100 companies. After that, I've had 15 years working as an executive coach and working with people on strategies. As John mentioned, I recently published a book. It's Connecting Life Skills for a Polarized World. One of the things I realized as I go through this, and people realized, is the things we teach in executive coaching, basically, especially the leadership side of it, are really life skills. I mean, people are the same people, whether you're working with them at work, whether you're working with them in your community, or whether they're part of your family. And so I wanted to take those and pull them together and make that more broadly accessible, because none of it is really that hard. It's just understanding it and being able to apply it in everyday life. One of my passions is working as a volunteer leadership coach with various nonprofits and or their board members. I'm an Oshkosh native. I think we have somebody from Lourdes here, graduate of Lourdes, and also UW Oshkosh. My family's lived in Oshkosh since, well, they were on the 1850 census. And yes, my kids had to watch out who they were dating in high school. So for today's objective, we're here to talk about conflict. And this is part of 2 sessions we're giving, one on conflict and one on one on confrontation. And so to set the stage, I want to make sure we have a shared understanding of what conflict is. One of the keys to all of our leadership skills is the ability to communicate. And every healthy function has a dysfunction. And communication is a process that results in a shared understanding. And that requires being able to verify that you know that the other person understands you. The counterfeit for that is when you inform somebody and you just give them information. Then what happens is you've abdicated the translation of that information to the other person, and you make the assumption that what you had intended to say is what they understand. And so that's why it's nice having the mics unmuted today, because if you have questions about this, this is a chance to be able to talk about it so that we do have a shared understanding of this thing when we finish today. So I'd like to make sure that we define conflict, understand what its benefit is, but understand also what its counterfeit is. Conflict frequently gets a bad rap, and people will, I sometimes run into teams, executive teams, any team that I work with that says, oh, well, we don't want conflict. And what it is usually they just don't understand conflict, because they do want conflict. They don't want conflict's counterpart, it's counterfeit. And we'll talk about what that counterfeit is a little bit later. The other thing that I want to have is let's talk about practically, how do we apply this? How do we use conflict to promote understanding? How do we use it to be able to help us with our delegation? And how do we use it in order to be able to establish a culture of accountability? And also, what are the questions that you have in your groups that we might want to answer? So I just want to stop for a minute, and I just like to ask, are there any questions that any of you want to make sure that we address as part of this today? Okay, this may be something that as we go along the lines is when the questions pop up. So feel free to jump in and interrupt. First of all, conflict is nothing more than different perspectives on the same situation. That's it. Unfortunately, conflict carries a lot of other baggage associated with it. When we use conflict, we frequently use it as a synonym for war, combat. When we say people are in conflict, we often look at some kind of pushing back and forth, an argument, a fight between people. But when you just look at conflict itself, it is nothing more than different perspective on the same situation. And by reducing it down and understanding that, when we have any kind of leadership behavior that we're talking about, whether it's communication, whether it's conflict, confrontation, decision making, any of those things, if we don't have a common definition of what it is, how are we going to talk about it? So if you're working with a group of people and you guys are having trouble with any of these communication, conflict, decision making, you might want to start one meeting by, without letting anybody work together, ask people to write down what are the definitions of communication, conflict, accountability, decision making. Pick whatever else you want to add. Let them write it down, and then share that, and see how close your definitions are to each other. A couple of things that might be a problem. One is if you have entirely different definitions of what some of those words mean. The other problem would be that your definitions are run for several sentences, several paragraphs. It's really hard to share something in common when it's more complex, when you have to memorize something that's long. So as a leader, you want to have something that's succinct. So one of the things about conflict is conflict could start with you in your leadership team if you don't have shared definitions around what some of these things are, and that those definitions aren't simple enough to be able to share with other people. As leaders, the most important thing that you can do is to produce other leaders. And leadership is behaving in a way that promotes the target outcomes. That is a behavior. It's not a place on the organization chart. It's not a title, although we use it as that. But leadership itself has to do with a behavior, and you want everybody on your team to be leaders. And if you're in a place like education, you want to be able to help the people that you're teaching to learn those leadership skills and become leaders themselves. So let's look at an example. We got some pictures here. Let's say that you had some friends get together or whatever, and you had 4 different pictures. And you're saying, I visited this place and here's what I saw. And of course, A looks kind of like a kitchen, and B looks like a family room. C, maybe a look out a screen house, and D is a music room. And what those are different perspectives, and you're in conflict with each other. So you could have an argument over what really is this place we went to, because we all were there, we all looked at it, and we all saw something different. But actually, it's all the same room. It's looking at that room from the center and just turning 90 degrees in different directions. We want conflict to come out into the open, because having those multiple views helps reduce our bias. And when I talk about bias now, I'm talking about more like a statistical thing, not about a prejudice or whatever, but it can help with reducing our bias, because by combining all of those views, we get a better idea of what reality really is. If one of us were just to turn around and dismiss everybody else and say, no, it's a family room, there's a fireplace, that's it, we would miss the richness that's there. So this happens to be a big open room that's got you can see the dining room table, you can see the living area, piano, all of that's just part of that same space. And so the benefit that we've got with this is this gives us a chance to be able to bring in different views from people, and we can find out that it may be that somebody on our team knows something that we don't, in which case I would like to know that. It may be that somebody on my team understands something other than, I understand something that I have not conveyed to them, that they have not been exposed to, in which case I want to know that. I want to be able to understand where somebody else is coming from before I try to lead them to where we want to go. And so don't be afraid of bringing out conflict. It's just different perceptions. You don't need to judge it. You don't need to say it's right or wrong. You don't need to try to change it. It's just a perception. And it's helpful to know, if you're going to be working with people, where they are starting, so that you can have a conversation that brings everybody together to a shared understanding. One of the reasons that we want to have conflict on teams and with people, and we want to uncover that conflict, is because every new idea starts with conflict. Creativity is producing ideas that are in conflict with the status quo. Now, I hold 7 US patents. All of them have to do with medical devices that are used in surgery. Every one of those patents started out as an idea that was different and in conflict with what the status quo was at that time. Some of them people thought were a little bit crazy until we were able to take them out and pilot some of them with people that actually did the work and turned around and said, yeah, this is going to eliminate these 3 things, or this is going to have this benefit for me. And we could sort out the new ideas and figure out which ones were the valuable ideas, the ones that would make a difference. So as you're looking for energizing a team, conflict is a good way to get people engaged. Having them bring up their different ideas may end up presenting you with things that you hadn't thought of before. I had a group of folks that I work with, and they're having trouble with retaining people. And this was a situation where there were entry-level positions that was involved with work where you had to be there for the shift, and a shift had to be covered. And unfortunately, some of the people were struggling with issues like childcare and transportation and things like that. And so you'd see people that would be missing, that sometimes I think just got overburdened to the point where they didn't show up. I mean, it wasn't like they resigned; they just quit showing up. And what they did is they tried the policy book approach, because that's what they were used to. Tell people what is expected of them and things like that. But they ran another experiment after that. I guess it was out of a desperation. They turned around and says, "So, what are some of the ideas you have? I mean, what are some of the things?" And they came up and said, "Well, you don't have some things, but you guys, they don't fit within the book." And they ended up putting together groups on social media where they could trade rides, where they could trade shifts, where they could trade and do things with childcare. And I'm not suggesting that's going to work for everybody, but because they were willing to bring in these ideas that conflicted with what their policies and way of doing things were, they were able to engage their people in finding a solution to a problem that both the company had and the employees had. And in the process of doing so, they put together a community among these folks that were working there that really was cohesive. Now, there are still people who left, and there are still people who struggle. But the number that stayed, the number that were able to work through it and be able to have success and being able to hold down that job while still taking care of the other responsibilities they had with the circumstances they were living with increased. And it was because they were open to understanding conflicting ideas with the things that they had presented. I just want to, again, stop for just a minute and see if there's anybody that had any questions about where we were so far with this. Would anybody have something they'd like to offer where they've run into conflict in their organization? Then it's either been something that's been able to help them, or where that conflict's put them in a situation that's been difficult to navigate. So as we look at conflict, the role of conflict and creating an environment where conflict is embraced it provides a more complete understanding. If you're looking at how to obtain an outcome or a goal, it helps to be able to understand what the landscape is you're operating in. And that landscape is sometimes messy, but being able to understand it puts you in a situation where you're able to respond to it versus having to react to it when it manifests itself, or worse yet, stumbling over it when we didn't talk about it or weren't made aware of it, and all of a sudden it emerges and makes itself visible to us. Each of us grew up under different circumstances. We've had different experiences. We're going to look at the world differently, and none of us see the world perfectly. So having a culture where you're able to openly share conflict and have that conflict be a neutral thing, neither good nor bad, it's just the way that you look at it, helps us to be able to get a picture of some other perspectives that we may not have had before. Kind of like that room, it grounds us in reality. It also helps promote progress, because one of the things that I see sometimes is teams that are working on something that really become wrapped up in what they're doing, and sometimes to the point where they develop their own language, they develop their own way of working together, and it kind of separates them from the group. But being able to have introduce differing views into that group and maintaining that makes it tougher for those barriers to be built. And the other thing it does is it elevates critical thinking over just turning around and thinking, well, that's what we did before, and that's the way it is. It's a different. It is an invitation more than it is something where here's the rules and this is what we're going to follow. It's still, we're going to follow along towards a shared intent, but if people have concerns along the way, it allows us to have those come up and we can address them, because they may not know something, or we can think about, is that something that we need to deal with at some point. But the important thing is, what happens is people realize that they've been listened to. Even if you don't have to agree with somebody in order to listen to somebody. One of the things we talked about was that conflict a lot of times is a dirty word. And the reason is that conflict's got its counterfeit, and that is contention. And contention is where somebody tries to impose their will on another person. And contention is when you confuse conflict with contention, what happens is it becomes more about who's right, who's wrong, who's the smartest person in the room. It becomes a power struggle versus what is the issue, what is the solution. So conflict in and of itself is about understanding reality, understanding an issue, understanding how we're going to take and make progress towards resolving that issue. Contention ends up being more about who's right, who's wrong, what's the best and what's not the best. Things get thrown into buckets, and a lot of times what happens is people who otherwise would have good ideas withdraw, and we don't hear what their concerns are, even though those concerns may be legitimate. The other thing is we turn around and we have contention and we impose our will, and what we've done is we've told people, you're going to do this. Now, accountability is keeping the agreements we make. And so if I'm working with somebody and we're talking about getting a particular piece of work done, and we talk through what the concerns are, we look at the different situations, and we agree, okay, there's multiple ways to do this, but can we agree that this is something that needs to get done and that you're going to work on it? Can we agree that we need to have this done by Tuesday? And can we agree that these are the constraints we need to live within? And, if I need a report, I'm not going to tell you got to do it in Word or Page or I don't know what, Google Documents or whatever. I need the report. I need the outcome. And the person says, yes, I agree. Let's do that. I'm going to be able to do that. Now you have accountability. Now you have somebody who's agreed to do something. And that agreement may occur in a conversation like that, or that agreement may occur when they come in the door and you walk through what the policies are. And rather than just handing them the book during an orientation session, you ask them, is this something that you can agree to work with? Do you have any concerns that any of this stuff is in conflict with what you can deliver? And you do that up front. That's using conflict. When you come in with contention and say, this is what you're going to do, and you tell them, that's it, boom, decide and announce, and they haven't agreed to anything, you come in afterwards, it's really hard after the fact to turn around and say, I'm gonna hold somebody accountable when I've never made an agreement with them. And if we were doing this on accountability, might be asking, what's accountability's counterpart? It's blame. Because accountability is about what is the issue and what are we doing to resolve it? It's not personal. Blame is about pointing at the person and telling them that they're wrong. They didn't do this right. Blame doesn't build strong connections. Blame goes ahead and places the cause on a person, whereas in a lot of situations, if you were to look at the issue, you'd find that there's multiple causes, multiple contributors, and it's really hard to deal with those if you already just automatically assign that to a person. And I did get a question about that ahead of time. I'm hoping that helps with that a little bit. We got some other things that we're going to be looking at as we go down here, and I'd be glad to talk about that at the end if there's some questions that arise. I see we have a Q&A. Okay, there's a question about how do you feel about when it's a safety issue within a workplace? I don't have a lot of context for the question, but what I'm going to make a couple assumptions here, and Nathan, you can help me out if there's something else with this. Every organization has certain values that it holds to be really important. Many organizations see safety as a value. A value is a decision that we make up front. It is a boundary that we're not going to cross. And so when we talk about our values, whether that's integrity, whether that is, our value is honesty, and we'd have to talk about what that means. But when you have a value like safety, what you have is you really have, this is a bright line boundary that we're not going to cross. And so if you have somebody that's in conflict with you on that, you need to maintain the boundary. And where the conflict should come in is in understanding what is the issue that's leading to the disconnect. I had a client that I'm working with where safety is their number one thing. That is it. Everything else they do fails if they're not safe at doing it. And they have situations where they have certain personal protective equipment that they expect to be worn. And there's certain operations that these folks do that really aren't in areas that require the personal protective equipment. And there was a debate back and forth about that because it was a corporate policy, and they ended up they listened to what the concerns of the group were, and they said, okay, can we agree that we're going to wear these things whenever we're on the floor or within these bays? And if we come out of these bays and are into these other areas, we can do without some of the personal protective equipment. But that is, if you guys go back in, you need to wear it. They were able to work on something that the team agreed to. And this was a union facility. It was a journey solving the problem, because not everybody was putting the equipment off and on. Sometimes they were forgetting, and but they were able to eventually to come to a resolution of it, because they ended up kind of listening to what the concerns were on that. Again, Nathan, I don't know what your particular circumstances are, and I sent out an email yesterday. If you'd like to reach out after this, I'd be happy to discuss the specifics of your situation. We could set up a time and just have a conversation about that. So when it comes to applying this, how do you go ahead and work with conflict? And one of the things is, if you're not open to looking at different ideas, if you're not open to listening to people, if you aren't willing to have some things come out that might be critical or whatever, it's hard to engage your team. You're probably not going to see the conflict. The conflict is still going to be there. So being able to turn around and say to people, look, we have some different ideas here. Are there other things we need to think about? You know, what are some of the things you guys are thinking? If you're not sure that everybody's on board with something or that they get it, ask the question, are there any questions? And if everybody just sits there and looks at you, pick one of the group and say, okay, so since there's no questions, John, why don't you summarize what we just covered for everybody else? And it's not that you want to put that person on the spot. It's what you want to assess whether or not everybody is on board and has a shared understanding of this. And if that person kind of looks like he or she is caught like a deer in the headlight, turn around and say, hey, you can ask anybody else on the team to help. Now, that 3 seconds between when you call on them and when you say you can ask anybody else, everybody else has gone from kind of, okay, this is almost over, to holy cow, what did they say? And you have their attention. And it may take a little bit, but is it worth spending that little bit of time up front, having those discussions and making sure that whatever conflict you have has been resolved around a shared understanding? Or would you just like to send them out with them nodding their heads when you say, does everybody understand? So by embracing conflict, you have a chance to be able to make sure that your team really does have a shared understanding before they go forward. And you also validate perspectives. If somebody turns around and says, I think it's goofy that we have to wear hard hats, don't tell them they're wrong. Just turn around and say, hey, I understand that's your perspective, but this is the policy that we put in place. And we're putting it in place for your benefit. But we're also putting it in place because that's just what we do. And is that something that you can live with? And see, what you're doing by asking that question is you're trying to establish accountability, not ordering them to do it. You can always fall back to, you don't got to like it, you just got to do it. But if you can get them to turn around and say, yeah, okay, I can do that, no matter how reluctant that is, you at least have an agreement from them that you're doing it. The other thing is sometimes we are in a state of conflict where you see there's all kinds of different perspectives, and you're sitting there and you're almost going into a panic because you're going, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to get this group together around the same thing? And like all fear, that catches on. And what happens is right away, involuntarily, when we get run into something that's unexpected, something that's causing us anxiety, we have a reaction that we want to fight, we want to flee, or we freeze. But if that happens and you feel like that's occurring, slow it down and try to see if we can't make the big decision today, can we at least come up with a smaller decision? Can we come up with a smaller agreement? So if you are figuring you got something pretty straightforward that we can agree on quickly, and you find out there's a lot of dissent and different ideas and strong passions around this, first of all, it's hard to have critical thinking occur when you're in that fight freeze flight piece. And if you have anybody else that's there, we'll slow it down and make it a smaller thing. Turn around and say, okay, we may not be able to agree on the decision today, but can we agree that we need to resolve this? And can we agree that this is the group that needs to do it? And then just take a break and come back. Can we meet tomorrow on this and start sorting through these things, seeing where some of these ideas are common, seeing which one of them may affect the issue, because again, it's about the issue, not about the people. See where there's places where maybe we need a little more information. Just make it a smaller decision, at least have a shared intent that this is something that we need to move forward with and address. A lot of people panic and they try to make sweeping decisions very quickly. And what happens is they end up imposing their will, and they end up introducing contention, and everybody goes away with it with kind of a bad and icky feeling. And even if they do agree with it in the meeting and they turn around and say, yeah, okay, how many times have you had that happen, that had all these hallway and office and shop floor discussions occurring about, I can't believe that they are deciding that happens when you speed it up too fast and you feel you just need to impose will. Sometimes it takes a little time to do that and build that trust and that understanding to move forward. We talked earlier about having agreements. Find common ground that you can agree to, even if that agreement is, can we agree that this is important? Can we agree that we're not on the same page? I don't know how many times I've been in situations where trying to facilitate a solution out of a diverse group, and people are all over the place on stuff. And I'll turn around and say, can we agree we're not going to solve this today? And everybody kind of like, yeah, we probably can't. Okay, well, if once I have that agreement, it gives me a place to start with and moving forward. Can we agree that it's important that we do this? Or can we agree we need to at least make some progress and understand this better? So try to focus on those places where you can bring people together and recognize you're on a journey. And a lot of times the things that we think absolutely got to get done right now, it may be that you just need to make that first step. Can we agree that we're going to quit doing this? If we have a problem that behavior we need to discontinue, can we agree that we're going to just suspend this for now, at least for the next week, while we work on trying to see an alternative to it? And it's hard to do that unless you've brought out the conflict. It's hard to do that unless you understand other people's perspectives. Now, we just, my wife and I just celebrated 40 years being married, and we went away to Hawaii in order to celebrate that. And we were on this tour with this small group of people, and there was a couple that was newlywed. They were on their honeymoon, so kind of like on the other end of things. And everybody was talking at the different stops. We were at I think it was at a volcano, and he says, 40 years. He says, what's the secret? And we said, we always fought fair. We always made it about what was the issue and not about the person. And so it was about, what happened is we put ourselves rather than facing off on either side of the table, we put the issue on one side of the table and we were on the other side. So if it was finance, it wasn't about you spent money on this, you did that, you did that. It was about, okay, what's the issue that we have here? How are we going to resolve this? Can each of us bring to the table? And he just looked at me and he goes, wow, that sounds like that's really a good idea. But the same thing holds true here, because this is a life skill. It holds true for when we're dealing with conflict. We don't want to get in a fight with somebody that is combat, but there are going to be fights, but we need to keep the fights fair. And one of the ways we can do that is when somebody brings up something that's in conflict with the way that you're looking at it, be curious, not furious. I sometimes have people say things that sound to me completely, totally off base in terms of where we're at. And I could turn around and say, well, where are you coming from, man? That's nuts. Well, that's kind of doesn't necessarily open them up for further discussion. But if I turn around and say, tell me more about that. A lot of times what I find out is there's actually some common ground here, but their way that they express themselves, the language that they're using, they may have some circumstances I wasn't aware of that were happening, sometimes out on the shop floor, sometimes in the office, wherever. But by being curious instead of furious, by being interested rather than flight, fight, or freeze, it allows me to gather more information. It allows me to keep an open connection with this person. It allows us to start connecting around understanding what's the issue and getting on the same side of the table in order to be able to address it. A lot of times when we run into conflict, especially if we're heading towards a goal and conflict emerges, what happens is we see it as an obstacle to our being able to get done what we intend to get done. And that is frustrating for us. And sometimes we let that frustration drive what we do. And if you feel that happening, slow down. Because if there are some obstacles there, if there is something that's going to get in the way, running it over and just blowing past it may mean that it just gets to be a bigger issue than slowing down and figuring out what it is. Sometimes the changes you're trying to make take more time for people to be able to understand and accept than you might think it is. I've got a couple of groups this has happened with, but one in particular right now, where the leadership team went off and over the course of 6 weeks developed a new policy about how they're going to do recruiting and onboarding. And then they came in and they, major change, came in and gave like a 2-hour PowerPoint and expected everybody after that and some training was going to be totally on board. These guys spent 6 weeks together, working through all the angles, talking through different stuff, developing their own language around it, becoming comfortable with it. And now they expected their leaders to be comfortable with it. And instead of asking, like, what are the concerns? How do we do this? What's a fair way or a good way to start implementing this? They just kind of decided and announced. And that was out there for about, I think, 4 or 5 months. And it just wasn't working. And they came back and said, well, why do you think this might not work? And they had a great system, but they didn't have the acceptance of it because they hadn't gone ahead and allowed people to really have time to get to know it. They didn't slow down enough in doing it. The last thing is you can communicate better with people sometimes with questions than you can with making statements. When you see somebody who's struggling with something, if the answer is obvious to you as to what it is, you may turn around and say, hey, here's what you ought to do. And that's appropriate. We have let's not have a committee meeting to determine which exit we're going to use. Let's just get out of the building. Okay. But there are some situations where you might want to turn around and use questioning and say, so what do you think's going on with this? And what have you tried so far? How has the results been? Some of those ways of looking at it may be different than what you're looking at. Something may come up that you hadn't thought of. But if you lead them with questions to the solution, they're the ones that have proposed the solution, not you. Then you can turn around. It's easy to turn around and say, well, that's great. Is that something that you can do with this going forward? You have accountability now. Not only have you gone ahead and understood what their situation is, you help them ask the right questions to get to the point where, they have a solution they feel good about. A lot of times it's not information. You can put the information into it if you need to. Hey, did you know that? But a lot of times what it is just helping people think about it different, helps you understand where their barriers are and helps them be able to take care of themselves. I just wanted to put this in perspective. As John mentioned, we're having another one of these on confrontation. And this first one was, of course, on conflict. And these two things actually work together. Conflict is beneficial for being able to really understand an issue. So when you have something come up, you want to create conflict so that you can understand the different perspectives. It's like walking into that room and looking at the different corners and bringing that together. What that does is that gives you some options, and whether you call it options, better understanding, hypotheses, things we could try, whatever it is, it brings some of that together, some of which might be novel, and some of it might be stuff that you discovered that already exists. But then what happens is you need to converge on what you're going to be doing. So whereas conflict is a diverging thing where you're coming up with options, confrontation is where you need to look at something and you need to choose what that solution is going to be. And on a personal basis, confrontation is being able to address an issue with somebody and to be able to come to a shared agreement that will result in accountability, even when you have different options on the table and different perspectives there. So I just bring that up because there's some questions that are unanswered here that you may still have, but we'd like to invite you back to confrontation. We'll talk more about that. In confrontation, we'll talk about 4 basic rules that if you follow them, really are going to allow you to work through confrontation in a positive way and make it a fair fight when you do it. So I'll just stop for a minute and ask, are there any questions that anybody has that haven't been addressed here?
Yeah.
And keep in mind, go ahead.
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, I was just going to say, I sent you all an email that we're on the list anyway, inviting questions. If you want to reach out afterwards and want to set up, 15 minutes to just talk about the specific situation you have, that invitation remains open. And I may have another chat that came in here that I didn't.
Joe, can you hear me?
Somebody. Yes.
Good morning. Just as I'm listening to your information and kind of processing some of these things, would it be fair to say that one of the earlier or more important steps in this process is to ask a series of open-ended questions to make sure you understand where you're at and where you need to get to?
Yes, and it's Dan.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dan. Yes, absolutely, Dan. Again, it depends on the circumstance. If you've got a fire drill, just
Right.
get out of the building. But a lot of times, most of the time, we have some latitude, and asking the questions and understanding the circumstances, even if this is the policy that we have to follow, at least allows you to understand where the other person is coming from, to maybe employ their language, to address their concerns, and really show that you really are honoring them as a person, that this just isn't a, you know, my way or the highway situation.
So would that make sense that those open-ended questions reflected back would help generate buy-in from both sides of the conflict so you can avoid then the confrontation, correct?
What it does is in the end, if you want to come to a common understanding, what it may happen is, you know, I have it up there as these two things. It may
Right.
just blur into one thing where the conflict is not a big deal because you've started that momentum in that, or excuse me, the confrontation isn't a big deal because you've started that momentum. But I have, I have a set of questions that are things like, I could go on with these, but you know, tell me more, help me understand that. I'm a little confused. Can you fill me in on what's going on here? If I ever feel like I just triggered something with somebody that where we might have some conflict, I ask open-ended questions and try to get them to talk more.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And if I'm dealing with a group and the group tends to all sit there and stare at you, and I know I'm going to be with that group, I might pull a couple people aside and ask them to start asking those questions, because people will, you know, if you have somebody that breaks the ice and models a behavior, sometimes that's, you know, you just plain need that.
You know,
I had
I did unmute
Oops.
people there, and I was a little late. I have to apologize on that draw there, Joe. I didn't unmute everybody at immediately. I thought I did, so I apologize for that. I see Elizabeth Coleman had a question come in, and Elizabeth, if you just want to just unmute yourself and ask that question, you know, we can do that, or else I'll just read it off.
Sure, I can do that. The question was around how do you instill within your organization that these types of conversations are worth the time and should be prioritized, especially when, you know, we have people working remotely or maybe cross-departmental discussions are important, but there's limited bandwidth amongst the teams.
One of the things that I try to have is some simple ground rules about how we're going to operate, and I try to reinforce those with people. One of the things is just to be honest, and to be honest means to tell it the way you see it while recognizing that the way you see it may not be the way it is. And especially with people working remotely, there's this tendency where my daughter is 25 years old. She was showing me all the memes of people like doing their laundry and then just touching the touchpad to look like they're still there, and things like that. That I think part of the key is you know, keeping your people engaged with this. And I think there might be more to your question than what I'm addressing right now. And Elizabeth, I'd invite you, if you got an email from me, I would invite you to just send me an email and let's talk about this for 25 minutes. You know, we'll set up some time and or 15 minutes, we'll just set up some time and talk about it. So I can better understand the context of your situation and maybe talk about it in a way that's more meaningful rather than giving these kind of broad principles. Is that fair?
Sounds great. Thank you, Joe.
Okay. Remote is a challenge, but it's just a challenge. I mean, there's manufacturing environments are a challenge, service things are a challenge. Everything presents challenges, and there's ways to address this. The key is you need to get and build connections between your people. You know, they need to connect with each other, and that really builds a community that you need to perform. I want to we just have a couple minutes left. I want to ask you and challenge you, write down one or two things that you can apply from today. If you don't write them down, this is just going to be, oh yeah, you know, I spent an hour where there were some interesting things, but I can't remember what they were. You invested an hour of your time in development. Make that development work for you. Make it applicable by writing a couple things down. The other invitation is join us again, Chamber, is hosting the second half of this, which is on confrontation, April 26th. Those of you that are here have my email. If you have any, like those specific situations you have, send me an email. We'll figure out a little bit of time to get together on the phone, and we can talk about your specific situation and how you might apply that. The other thing is check out my book, Connecting Life Skills for a Polarized World. All the stuff we're talking about is in there, and it has tons of examples, everything from raising kids to dealing with executive teams. It's intended to show that these things are things that apply across our lives. And you can look up joethompsonauthor.com to kind of get a taste of that. And there's a link to reading a sample of the book in there. I'd like to thank John and the Chamber for the chance to be able to participate in this. And also those of you that are here today, for you investing your time. Again, I really encourage you to take one or two things at least and start applying them so that you can develop as a leader, so that you can get benefit out of the time that you invested here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned, it's been recorded. It will be posted, so you can go back later to if you need a little update on some things that Joe talked about. So again, hope you can all join us on Tuesday, the 26th for the follow-up for this session. And with that, we will again sign off here, and thank you one more time for being with us. So thanks, Joe.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody.